16 men climbed into helicopters on the south lawn of the White House on Friday afternoon, August 13, 1971, and they were given 3 instructions before the rotors started turning. Do not tell your families where you are going, do not call your officers, and do not, under any circumstances, speak to the press. They flew north into the Catoctin Mountains of Maryland to the presidential retreat at Camp David, and for the next 3 days they were sealed off from the world so completely that one of them later joked he half expected to be told a war had started. No war had started. Something quieter was happening. Over that single weekend, behind locked doors, without a vote in Congress, without a hearing, without the knowledge of America's closest allies, those 16 men rewrote what the dollar is. When they flew back to Washington on Sunday, the president went on television at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, interrupting the most popular Western on the air, and delivered a speech that lasted about 18 minutes. Buried inside it was one word, a single adverb chosen carefully by a speechwriter that weekend, and that one word is still legally in effect more than 50 years later. Every dollar you have ever earned, saved or spent was minted in the shadow of that Sunday night. In this episode, I am going to take you inside that room. You will learn the names of every man at the table and which of them fought the decision to the last hour. You will learn about the foreign demand delivered days earlier that historians believe forced the timing. You will learn the one word in the speech that turned a temporary emergency measure into a permanent new kind of money. And I will show you something that almost every retelling of this story gets wrong. The actual year America left gold, because it is not 1971, and the real answer changes how you see the entire weekend. One man in that room wrote in his private journal that what they were doing might be a tragedy. We will get to what he saw coming. Here is exactly what this episode will put on the table. First, the full roster of the Camp David 16, including the 32-page contingency plan one of them had quietly drafted 2 years before the crisis, waiting in a drawer for exactly this weekend. Second, the trigger, the specific foreign gold demands in the first 2 weeks of August 1971, including the famous story of a French warship steaming toward New York, and whether that ship ever actually existed. Third, the word, the single adverb in Nixon's Sunday speech that was supposed to expire in months and has now outlived every man who approved it. Fourth, the arithmetic. What a $1971 has become according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics' own calculator, and what an ounce of gold priced at $35 that Friday sells for today. And fifth, the dissenter, the one advisor who argued against closing the gold window, lost the argument and then spent the rest of the decade watching his warnings arrive one by one, recorded in a journal that was not published until after his death. A note on method before we begin. This channel works from the primary record, in this case the published diaries of participants, above all the secret diary of Arthur Burns, published in 2010 under the title Inside the Nixon Administration, the memoirs of William Safire and Paul Volcker, Safire's in his book Before the Fall and Volcker's, Safire's in his book Before the Fall and Volcker's in Changing Fortunes, the Haldeman diaries and Treasury and Bureau of Labor Statistics figures, all of which I will name as we go. Where the record is disputed, I will tell you it is disputed. Now, to understand why 16 men were hiding in the Maryland woods, you have to start 11 days earlier, in the first week of August 1971, when the government of France did something quietly hostile. According to Treasury records cited by historians of the period, France presented roughly $191 million in American currency and asked for the one thing the United States had promised since 1944 that it would always deliver in exchange: gold. Physical, weighable, 40-ounce bars of it, out of the vaults of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, a vault that sits roughly 80 feet below the streets of Lower Manhattan, resting directly on the bedrock of the island because no building floor could carry the weight. The United States paid. It had no legal choice, and France was not acting on a whim. This was the culmination of the campaign that went back to February of 1965, when President Charles de Gaulle, coached by his economic advisor Jacques Rueff, stood before the press in Paris and publicly called for the world to return to actual gold, and complained that the dollar's special status let America run deficits without consequence, a status de Gaulle's own finance minister, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, had already branded with a phrase that stuck forever: the exorbitant privilege. For 6 years, France had been converting dollars into metal, steadily, deliberately, and the August conversion was simply the latest turn of the screw. Then, on Thursday, August 12th, a report reached the Treasury that the British had made an inquiry of their own, and in the version that landed on desks in Washington that afternoon, Britain wanted assurance covering as much as $3 billion. Paul Volcker, then the Treasury's Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs, later wrote that the report was garbled and the actual British request was smaller and more technical, a request for cover against exchange losses rather than a demand for bars. But it did not matter what the truth was. What mattered was what the men in Washington believed on Thursday night, which was that the run had begun. Not a run by depositors on a bank, but a run by governments on a country. And the numbers said the run could not be survived, because in the first week of August alone, by contemporary estimates, more than $1 billion had moved against the American position, and the Treasury's own gold stock had fallen below the psychologically critical level of $10 billion for the first time since the 1930s. The next morning, President Richard Nixon ordered his economic team assembled and moved to Camp David, and the secrecy was absolute, because if word leaked that America was even discussing its gold promise, every central bank on earth would demand its metal by Monday morning, and the vaults would be stripped before lunch. So they vanished into the mountains, gathering in Aspen Lodge, the president's own cabin, where Nixon opened the first session by telling the group that everything said in that room was to stay in that room. The dominant voice that weekend, by every participant's account, was not an economist. It was John Connally, the Treasury Secretary, a Texas politician who had been in the car when Kennedy was shot in Dallas and carried a swagger, as one colleague put it, that filled the room, and Connally's view of the world was captured in a line he is widely reported to have used with his staff, that the foreigners were out to take advantage of America, and America's job was to get there first. A few months later, facing the assembled finance ministers of Europe in Rome, he would compress the entire doctrine into a single sentence that European officials still quote with a wince: "The dollar is our currency, but it is your problem." Connally wanted the gold window closed, a 10% surcharge slapped on all dutiable imports, and a 90-day freeze on every wage and price in the country, all announced at once as a show of strength. Around the table with him sat the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Arthur Burns, pipe in hand, the only man arguing for delay. The budget director, George Shultz, a University of Chicago economist who privately wanted the currencies to float and saw the crisis as the door to that world. Paul Volcker, 6 feet 7 inches tall, carrying the technical brief. The economic advisors Paul McCracken and Herbert Stein, Peter Peterson, Caspar Weinberger, the president's men, Haldeman and Ehrlichman, taking notes for their diaries, and a speechwriter named William Safire, who had been told almost nothing about why he was there, and who learned what was happening when Herb Stein remarked to him on the helicopter that the gold window might be closed, and Safire had to pretend he understood what a gold window was. By Saturday, the substantive argument was effectively over. Burns had made his case against suspension on Friday night and lost it, and the rest of the weekend went to packaging. Nixon, by Haldeman's account, worried at length over a detail no economist would have thought of, that a Sunday night address would preempt Bonanza, the most watched Western on television, and irritate the very families he was trying to reassure. He gave the speech anyway, waking at 3 in the morning to redraft passages in his own hand, and on Sunday, August 15th at 9 p.m., he told the country he was ordering a wage and price freeze, an import surcharge, and the suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold, wrapping all of it in an attack on what he called international money speculators. The next morning, in one of the stranger verdicts in financial history, the Dow Jones Industrial Average rose almost 33 points, at the time the largest one-day gain it had ever recorded, because the market heard the freeze and the surcharge and cheered, and almost nobody understood that the quiet third item was the one that would still be governing their money 50 years later. What those men decided in 50-some hours of talk on a wooded hilltop was about to land in the living room of every family in America, including, if your parents or grandparents were alive that night, yours. To see why the decision was even possible, you need the machinery underneath it, and the machinery has a birthplace, July 1944. The Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, where 730 delegates from 44 Allied nations spent 3 weeks designing the money of the post-war world while that war was still being fought, 3 weeks before Paris was even liberated. The intellectual duel at the heart of the conference was between two men, John Maynard Keynes, representing an exhausted and nearly bankrupt Britain, who proposed a neutral international currency he called Bancor that would belong to no single nation, and Harry Dexter White of the United States Treasury, who proposed instead that the dollar itself sit at the center of the world. White held the cards because America held the gold, and White's design won. The conference created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and it created the system that matters for this story. Every major currency would be pegged to the American dollar, and the dollar alone would be pegged to gold at exactly $35 per ounce, a price any foreign government could rely on the way you rely on a meter being a meter. The dollar was not gold, but it was a claim check on gold, and the whole world agreed to treat the claim check as good. And here is the part almost every retelling gets wrong, the open loop I promised you. Ordinary Americans were never part of that promise. American citizens had already lost the right to redeem dollars for gold in 1933 under Franklin Roosevelt's Executive Order 6102, which required citizens to turn in their gold coins, bars, and certificates on pain of a fine of up to $10,000, a decade in prison, or both. The following year, the Gold Reserve Act moved the official price from $20.67 to $35 an ounce, an overnight devaluation of roughly 40% in the dollars in every American pocket, executed by statute against citizens who had just been legally stripped of the ability to protect themselves by holding the metal. So when people say America went off gold in 1971, they are compressing two events. For you, for your family, the gold-backed dollar died in 1933. What survived until 1971 was a gold-backed dollar for foreign governments only, a members-only window at the back of the building. And by 1971, that window was writing checks the vault could not cash. The problem had a name before it had a crisis. In 1960, a Belgian-born Yale economist named Robert Triffin told the Congress of the United States, and then the world in a book called Gold and the Dollar Crisis, that the system carried its own death sentence because the world needed ever more dollars to trade with, and every new dollar sent abroad was a new claim on a fixed pile of gold, so the system could satisfy the world's need for liquidity only by destroying the credibility of its anchor. Economists still call this the Triffin dilemma, and the arithmetic ran only one direction. In the years after the war, the United States held something on the order of 20,000 tons of gold, roughly 2 of every 3 ounces held by governments anywhere on Earth, the largest hoard ever assembled. By August of 1971, foreign governments and institutions held dollar claims commonly estimated at more than $40 billion, while the gold stock backing them was worth roughly $10 billion at the official price. 4 claim checks for every 1 bar. The system had already required emergency surgery once. Through the 1960s, 8 Western central banks ran a scheme called the London Gold Pool, jointly selling metal into the London market to hold the private price at $35, and in March 1968 the pool collapsed under the weight of speculative buying, forcing the creation of a 2-tier market in which governments pretended gold was worth $35 while everyone else paid what it actually cost. That same year, Congress quietly removed the last requirement that Federal Reserve notes be backed by gold at all. So the window was not a promise anymore. It was a bluff, and France was calling it. Which means the honest way to describe the Camp David weekend is not that 16 men broke the system was already broken. What they did was choose the hour of the announcement, and the economic historian Barry Eichengreen is among those who have described the suspension, bluntly, as functionally a default. the moment a debtor tells its creditors the collateral is no longer available. The men at Camp David did not use that word. They chose a different one, and we are coming to it. But first, watch what the decision did once it left the mountain, because it did not land on everyone equally. Consider a machinist in Toledo, Ohio, a composite of the era's typical saver, a man of about 45 with $8,000 in a passbook savings account earning roughly 5%, a rate that was not even his bank's choice because a Depression-era rule called Regulation Q capped what banks were allowed to pay him, money set aside across 15 years for his retirement. He heard the Sunday speech, understood almost none of it, and went to work Monday. Nothing in his account changed. No money was taken. And yet, by the Bureau of Labor Statistics' own Consumer Price Index, prices in the United States more than doubled over the following decade, with inflation running at 12.3% in 1974 and peaking at 13.3% in 1979. Do the arithmetic on his position in any of those years. Prices rising 12%, savings growing 5% is a real loss of roughly 7% a year, compounding silently, and a 7% annual loss cuts a sum of money in half in about 10 years. So by the early 80s, his $8,000 grown politely on paper to perhaps $13,000 could buy roughly half of what the original sum could have bought the night of the speech. He was never robbed. There was simply nothing left to anchor what a dollar meant, and the drift did the work a thief never could. And notice the distributional cruelty of it, because the machinist's neighbor, who owed 30 years of fixed payments on his house, was on the other side of the same drift, watching inflation quietly shrink his mortgage in real terms year after year. The new money punished savers and rewarded debtors, and nobody had voted for that transfer either. Now cross the Pacific. In Japan, the announcement is remembered to this day by its own name, Nixon Shock coup, the Nixon Shock, and the shock was doubled by an insult because Washington had given its closest Asian ally no warning at all. In Tokyo, in the 2 weeks after the announcement, the Bank of Japan faced an impossible choice because Japan's entire post-war export economy, the whole machine of Toyota and Sony and the steel mills, was built on a yen fixed at 360 to the dollar, a rate that had stood since 1949. Rather than let the yen rise, the Bank of Japan kept its exchange market open when Europe's closed and kept buying dollars, absorbing by contemporary accounts something on the order of 4 billion of them in a matter of days, an enormous sum for the time, essentially purchasing depreciating paper to defend a price everyone knew was dead. Within 2 weeks, Japan gave up and let the yen climb, and by December, it had been formally revalued to 308 to the dollar, an upward move of nearly 17%, the largest revaluation any major country accepted that year. An ally that had held dollars in good faith took the loss for holding them, and every finance ministry on earth wrote down the lesson, which is one reason central banks today sit on reserves and watch Washington the way a burned creditor watches an old borrower. And third, watch what happened to the word temporary. In December 1971, in the castle of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, the finance ministers of the Group of 10 signed an agreement to patch the system, repricing gold at $38 an ounce, widening the bands within which currencies could move to 2.25% and adjusting the pegs, and Nixon publicly called it the most significant monetary agreement in the history of the world. It survived roughly 14 months. By February 1973, the dollar was devalued again, this time against a gold price of $42.22, a number I want you to remember because it is going to reappear near the end of this episode in a place you will not expect. Weeks later, in March 1973, the pegs were abandoned entirely and the world's major currencies began to float against one another, valued by nothing but markets and belief, which is the arrangement you have lived under every day of your life since. The most significant agreement in history had lasted about as long as a school year. The temporary measure, meanwhile, was becoming the architecture. So let me now close the promises one by one, 5 entries in the ledger of that weekend in order. Entry 1. The men and the plan. The Camp David 16 were Nixon, Connally, Burns, Volcker, Schultz, McCracken, Stein, Peterson, Weinberger, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Sophia, and a handful of senior staff, and the striking fact is that the plan they executed was not improvised that weekend. Paul Volcker had led a working group that, as early as 1969, produced a contingency study examining suspension of gold convertibility, so that when the crisis arrived, the intellectual work was already sitting in a drawer. The weekend was not brainstorming. It was a decision about whether to open the drawer, and the man who had filled the drawer spent the weekend, by his own later account, deeply uneasy because Volcker wanted suspension used as leverage to negotiate a new fixed system, not as a door slammed forever. And he watched Connolly and Schultz, for opposite reasons, make sure the door stayed shut. Entry 2, the trigger and the warship. The French conversion of roughly $191 million in early August and the garbled British inquiry of August 12th were the proximate causes, but you may have heard a more cinematic version, that France sent a naval vessel to New York Harbor to carry its gold home. That story appears constantly in retellings, and the documentary record for it is thin. Volcker and others involved indicated the conversions moved the way such things actually move, by cable and by ledger entry between vaults, with much of the gold never leaving the basement of the New York Fed at all, because dozens of nations store their bars in that same bedrock vault in separate numbered compartments, and a conversion often meant workers in magnesium-toed shoes loading bars onto a cart and wheeling them 30 feet from the American compartment to the French one. The warship makes a better movie. The cart in the basement is what the evidence supports. And, in a way, the cart is the more damning image, because it means the run on America was conducted politely, indoors, one squeaking cartload at a time. Entry 3. The word. In the draft William Safire helped prepare that weekend, the operative sentence had the president directing the Treasury to, quote, suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily. Safire recounted it before the fall, but he asked whether the suspension was in fact temporary, and the answer he received was the answer politicians give when the honest answer is no. The suspension was never lifted, not that year, not that decade. In January 1976, the major economies met in Kingston, Jamaica, and formally rewrote the rules of the International Monetary Fund to accept floating currencies, and with the Second Amendment to the fund's articles, which took effect in 1978, gold's official role in the world's money quietly ended on paper. 5 years after it had ended in fact, and member nations were actually forbidden from pegging their currencies to gold again. The temporary adverb is now older than most of the people hearing this sentence. Entry 4. The arithmetic. On Friday, August 13, 1971, an ounce of gold was $35 by law. By 1974, it traded near 180. On January 21, 1980, in the panic after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, it touched 850, and in recent years it has traded above $2,000 an ounce, a number that would have read as science fiction to anyone at that table. Run it from the other side and the picture is the same. By the Bureau of Labor Statistics inflation calculator, it takes well over $7 today to buy what $1 bought in 1971, which is another way of saying the 1971 dollar retains something like 13 cents of its old purchasing power. A median American house that year sold for roughly $25,000. A new full-size car cost under $4,000. A gallon of gasoline cost about 36 cents. The bills did not change. What they measured did. Entry 5. The dissenter. Arthur Burns, chairman of the Federal Reserve, the oldest man in the room and the only one whose job was, on paper, to defend the currency, argued through that Friday night against closing the window, warning that the stock market could break, that Pravda would trumpet the collapse of capitalism, and that the world's trust in American money, once spent, could not simply be reissued. He lost, and he lost partly because he was compromised, because the diaries show Burns had spent 1971 under relentless White House pressure to keep money easy ahead of the 1972 election, pressure that included planted press stories attacking him, and the Fed's own expansion that year was feeding the very speculative outflows the weekend was called to stop. And in the journal entries published 39 years later as Inside the Nixon Administration, Burns recorded his anguish in private language he never used in public, fearing for the world monetary order he had spent his life inside, and confessing his despair at a White House he saw as governed by politics all the way down. Here is the bitter shape of what followed. The great inflation of the 1970s arrived on Burns's own watch at the Fed, and the man who finally broke it, a decade later, was Paul Volcker, the sane, quiet undersecretary who had carried the contingency plan up the mountain. Appointed Fed chairman in August 1979, Volcker drove the federal funds rate toward 20%, pushed the prime rate that banks charge their best customers to 21.5% by 1981, and accepted a recession that sent unemployment to 10.8% by late 1982, the worst since the Depression, with farmers blockading the Fed's headquarters with tractors and builders mailing him, sawed off 2x4s from houses they could no longer sell off 2x4s from houses they could no longer negotiate. The Weekend's staff economist spent the following 10 years paying its bill and then presenting it at ruinous interest to the entire country. And now the number I told you to remember, $42.22. If you go today to the published financial statements of the United States Treasury, you will find the nation's gold, roughly 261.5 million ounces of it, about 147 million ounces at Fort Knox and the rest at West Point, Denver, and the New York Fed, still carried on the government's books at exactly that price, the statutory value fixed by law in 1973 and never updated since. On paper, the entire American gold hoard is worth about $11 billion. At market prices, it is worth on the order of $500 billion. This is an accounting convention, not a conspiracy, and I want to be careful to say so, because no vault door is hiding anything here. The holdings themselves are public and audited. But the convention tells you something. Revaluing the gold would mean officially answering a question no administration since Nixon's has wanted to reopen. The question of what, if anything, the metal in Fort Knox and West Point still has to do with the dollar in your pocket. It is easier to leave the ledger frozen at the last moment the old world was alive. So the books of the United States still record in their own quiet way the price of that weekend, like a clock stopped at the hour of the accident. Step back then and look at what those 3 days actually were. Not the invention of paper money, which this channel has traced before, and not theft in any legal sense, because every step was lawful. It was the moment the last thread between American money and anything outside human decision was cut by 16 men in secret over a weekend, announced in 18 minutes between Sunday programs, carried by one adverb that was allowed to quietly become permanent. Nobody voted on it. Almost nobody alive today was consulted about it. And every price you have ever paid, every wage you have ever earned, every account you have ever watched grow or shrink, has floated on the sea that weekend opened. The men of Camp David are gone now. The word they chose is still working. If tracing that kind of hidden ledger is worth 30 minutes of your time, subscribe to the channel and leave a like so these histories find the people who carried them in their wallets, and I will see you at the next entry in the ledger.